Welcome to the webinar, Nuisance Alarms, Menace to the Operator. We're talking about process operators in a process plant. Some information about the webinars. Audio is done via GoToWebinar. Everyone hopefully is already muted. If you have questions along the way, feel free to enter them into the questions poll menu on the side, and we'll try and answer them at the end or answer them after the webinar and distribute those results. So my name is Todd Stauffer. I'm the Director of Alarm Management here at Exida, and I've been involved in the standards bodies that have been developing guidelines for alarm management, mainly ISA 18.2. Been involved with them since 2005 as an editor and voting member. I've also been involved with some of the subsequent work to the standard, creation of technical reports, one on alarm philosophy, one on basic alarm design, and my latest role right now is as the co-chair of the ISA 84.91.03 standard, which is on safety controls, alarms, and interlocks. So a little bit about Exida. We were formed in 1999 with a vision to make the world, as in process plants, a safer place. We primarily focused initially on functional safety, but realized that there's more to preventing risk or mitigating risk in a process plant than just safety. So several years after we were founded, we expanded that scope to include cybersecurity and alarm management, and alarm management is what I do here. One of the areas that we focus on in safety is certification of devices for use in safety instrumented systems. So if you've ever worked with a SIL 2 or SIL 3 capable transmitter, chances are it was Exida that did that assessment and certification. We also do certification of people to allow them to help them come up to speed with the competence necessary to support safety tasks and to demonstrate that competence to make sure they know what they need to. We also have a suite of tools for safety instrumented system design that follows the whole entire functional safety life cycle, including a tool called SIL Alarm, which is a tool for alarm rationalization, which we'll talk about a little bit during this webinar. So, speaking of the webinar, what are we going to talk about? This is focused on nuisance alarms for a process operator. So we'll talk about what a nuisance alarm is, and we'll talk about why it's bad, what it can do, its impact on the operator. And then we'll talk about the different types of nuisance alarms, how we identify them. We'll talk about the alarm management practices that we can put in place to minimize or eliminate nuisance alarms. But one of the key things that we'll focus on is human factors. The wild card in all this is the operator and the way people behave. So we're going to spend a good amount of time talking about how nuisance alarms impact the way the operator behaves towards alarms and responds, because that's a key element of what we need to address to make the nuisance alarm issues go away. So on that note, we'll get started with a quiz question. So I want you to think about what role in today's society analyzes information, diagnoses situations, predicts outcomes, and takes action to deliver value. Is it A, an airline pilot, B, a doctor, C, an air traffic controller, D, an operator, or E, all of the above? As you can probably imagine, this was not really a serious question, but what I wanted you to realize is operators are similar in what they do and what they need to do as airline pilots, doctors, and air traffic controllers, in that they take in a lot of information and need to make quick decisions that may have significant impact on the operation of your plant in this case. So they need to be able to make quick decisions, and obviously they need to have the best information available to help them make those decisions. Well, having an effective alarm system working is key to helping them perform their role effectively. Alarm system and alarms in particular. So let's look at what an alarm is actually supposed to do. Relatively simple concept. If we look at this graph here on the left, in most times, hopefully, the process control system, or the DCS, is able to keep the process variable within the green zone, a normal operating area. But there may be situations that occur where the process starts to deviate and starts to go away from where you want it to be, and it enters into the yellow zone, or the abnormal situation area. That's when we want the alarm to occur, to notify the operator that an abnormal situation has occurred that requires their attention, requires their corrective action to prevent a consequence from occurring. So if the operator responds correctly, and we hope that the alarm also guides them in coming up with what the appropriate response is, but if the operator does respond correctly, then the process turns around, and you can see via the line that goes back to the green area that the alarm clears. So appropriate corrective action done in time will hopefully clear the issue, and the process will go back into the normal operating area, into the green zone. If the operator is not able to respond in time, or does not take the correct response, then the process will likely continue to escalate, or the hazard will continue to escalate until we run into a consequence. And that could be a shutdown, could be an activation of the SIS, or it could be some other incident. So really the purposes of alarms are, number one, either to drive you back into the green zone, to essentially try and keep you within the normal operating limits, or number two, to prevent you from getting into the red zone, which is where a safety incident or a safety situation could occur. But one of the key things was to see that when the alarm occurs and the operator responds, the situation will change and it will correct itself. So now if we look at a real-life operating plant where the operator's alarm summary display is full of alarms, and those alarms have been there a long time, days, weeks, months, and we say, well, those alarms that are on there, which are called stale alarms, are obviously not following the purpose that we just talked about, which was alarm occurs, operator responds, situation corrects itself, and the alarm clears. So these are examples of nuisance alarms, and there's something about them that they are not following what an alarm is supposed to be. In other webinars, we've talked about the most common alarm management issues and how they impact operator performance. In this webinar, we're just going to focus on a subset of them, the nuisance alarms. So we'll look at chattering alarms, standing still alarms, bad actors, and redundant alarms. So we've been talking about a nuisance alarm, but let's define what it is. Everyone has kind of a general concept of what it would be, but let's look at the actual definition. So a nuisance alarm is an alarm that enunciates excessively, unnecessarily, or does not return to normal after the correct response is taken. So what does that mean? That means that, let's say we put in a new alarm into our system, and that alarm occurs, and the operator, if they've been trained on how to respond to it, which they should have been, will respond appropriately and take the corrective action and watch to see whether the alarm clears. Well, what if the alarm doesn't clear and that alarm just stays there and doesn't go away, but nothing happens? That would be an example of a nuisance alarm. Well, what's going to happen the second time that alarm occurs? Is the operator going to respond the same way? Probably they will the second time, but how about the third and the fourth time? After a while, they will realize that it doesn't matter whether they respond or not. It doesn't make a difference. No consequence will occur. Nothing is happening different in the process. So thus the nuisance alarm. And part of the dangers of this scenario is that the operators start to develop a culture where they think that they can ignore alarms, that their action and their attention is not really required. It's kind of like the boy who cried wolf scenario, or story, if you've ever heard of it. And nuisance alarms can also, essentially desensitize the operator, making them think that alarms are not that important because they either don't require their corrective action or nothing happens when they respond, and or they don't respond, no consequences occur. So as I mentioned, analogous to the boy who cried wolf. So now let's take a look at that scenario, and I'm going to try to play a video here that we have created. To help looks like we're having some technical difficulty with the video, so we'll include that as a link in our distribution of the information. But essentially we're showing the analogy between the boy who cried wolf and nuisance alarms, alarms that essentially go off expecting or wanting the operator to take action when there's no need for them to take action. After a while, they start to ignore those alarms. But at some point, there may be a scenario where those alarms should not have been ignored, just like when the wolf actually shows up, and you can have a problem because the operator has ignored the alarms. And that's one of the reasons why dealing with nuisance alarms is such an important thing to do. Now, that was not just a hypothetical example. We'll look at how that plays out in the real world. So this is an example from a chemical plant where we had a couple of reagent pumps that were transferring reagent into a neutralization area. Well, they developed a leak, and that leak was collected in a dike and into a sump. At some point, the operator received a high-level alarm in the sump. Sound familiar, related to the video? And they ignored that alarm. Then they received a high alarm. They ignored that as well because they were used to ignoring the high alarm. And they focused on what was going on in the neutralization area, which was the upset. They couldn't figure out how to address the situation because they were so focused on the neutralization area. They basically ignored what was happening from the reagent pumps and the sump, thinking that because it was a nuisance alarm and because it could be ignored, it didn't factor into the situation and didn't factor into the diagnosis or the corrective action. So the operator ignored it. And then the new operator came on shift. They did their walk around the grounds and saw that the sump had actually overflowed and spilled 10,000 gallons into the environment. So all because the operator had ignored the high and high level alarms. Now, part of the reason why they had done that was because those alarms, the high alarm was a nuisance alarm that occurred regularly because of the design, would occur every time that the pump started. So that alarm was tied to the set point for the level to automatically start the pump. So that was a nuisance alarm that the operator tolerated or ignored. And because of that, when the high alarm came from that same area, they were so used to ignoring the high alarm that they didn't realize that that could indicate a different situation, and they thought it was still acceptable to ignore that. So that's actually an issue with nuisance alarms and operators developing a false sense of what is happening or what's important because of the presence of those nuisance alarms. So let's talk about how we got into this situation, because the situation now with the modern DCS is probably more challenging than it was in the past, when there was limited real estate in your control room for alarms. So there was a lot of thought put into what points should be alarmed, because they went up on the wall and were connected via wiring, and there was some significant investment in wiring and cost and setup to make that work. So there's a lot of thought put into what alarms were needed and why. Fast forward to the modern DCS, where alarms are in software. They're essentially free. It seemingly doesn't take any action or thought to enable an alarm. And if you're not sure whether you need an alarm or not, most people would go ahead and think they would be safe by enabling the alarm. And that is one of the precipitators for nuisance alarms, because we've configured alarms that we didn't really identify what they're supposed to be for. So maybe they're not for anything, and maybe they shouldn't be alarms in the first place. And that is one of the main causes of nuisance alarms. Now, the way to get out of that is to kind of go back to the thought process of the past, where we looked at every alarm from a critical point of view and said, what's the purpose of this alarm? What's the operator supposed to do? What's the consequence? We went through and made sure that each alarm had value for the operator, and there was some reason for it. And that is a process called alarm rationalization. And that is key to helping to eliminate nuisance alarms. So now let's talk about different types of nuisance alarms and how you identify them. One type is called a chattering alarm. These are alarms that occur with a high frequency, so maybe 3 times in a minute. So they go into alarm and then they clear pretty quickly thereafter. You know, they may be in alarm for only a couple of seconds. So they obviously clear before, or not as a result of the operator's action. The operator may in fact have not even acknowledged the alarm or noticed it yet before it's cleared already. So you can end up with a lot of alarm events, and obviously this can become a really significant annoyance to the operator, because not only is it a nuisance or false alarm, but the fact that it goes in and out of alarm so frequently can really create a point of confusion for the operator. Another type of nuisance alarm is a fleeting alarm, similar to a chattering alarm, but it just does not immediately repeat. Now, one of the best ways to identify these types of nuisance alarms is through some reporting software. In this example, we can see some of the modules, particularly the very first one, batch transfer line flow. That alarm actually occurred 50,000 times, and it was active for an average of 5 seconds. So again, that alarm is clearing. It's going into alarm and clearing 5 seconds later, obviously not having anything to do with what the operator is doing. But you can imagine if you had an alarm that occurred 50,000 times in a month, that you're going to have your alarm horn going off constantly, and that's going to really drive you crazy. So one of the reasons why you want to identify these alarms so that they can be fixed. Standing alarm is an alarm that's in an active state. If it's active for more than 24 hours, an extended period of time, then we call it a stale alarm. These are the alarms that constantly are displayed on the alarm summary display that clog the display so that there's always a bunch of alarms on there, making it much more difficult for the operator to detect a new alarm when it comes in. Obviously, if you had a blank screen, a clean screen of no alarms, and you got a new alarm, it's much easier to see than if you have a screen that's already full of stale alarms and a new one comes in. These alarms can be challenging to get rid of because there's a lot of different reasons why they could occur. One might be that the alarm limit or alarm condition is not appropriate for the state of the process, in which case it's not going to change, or the alarm's not going to go away until that process state changes. So we'll talk about how to eliminate those. We also want to use our reporting software to be able to identify which are those stale alarms. Here we can look and we see that actually we have a high-level interlock for a tank that's there for protection purposes that's been active for over a day. Now, it's a pretty dangerous situation if that's a safety rated interlock or has some safety functionality, because when the alarm is stale and active, it obviously can't re-annunciate or can't go off again to indicate that that a problem has occurred. So it's almost as if the alarm doesn't exist or it's disabled because it's already active, so it can't re-annunciate to let you know that something has happened. Another type of nuisance alarm is called a bad actor, or frequently occurring alarms. If you look at an unrationalized alarm system, you'll typically find that there's maybe 10 to 20 alarms that produce the majority of the activations. And in this example, we can see that the top 10 alarms in this system, which may have 10,000 configured alarms, but the top 10 that actually activate to the operator create 52% of the activations. So way more than you would think that they should. So obviously we want to identify these bad actors so we can fix them. Another type of nuisance alarm is a cascading or redundant alarm. So you have an event that occurs, interlock trip, for example, that initiates a series of other events that occur, which result in their own set of expected alarms. So we end up with redundant alarms. One event occurs, we end up with 2, 3, 4, 10 alarms occurring, all that basically indicate the same thing has happened. So we want to get rid of those as well. Now, the international standards on alarm management, both ISA 18.2 and IEC 62682, provide some guidance on alarm system performance metrics, and specifically related to nuisance alarms. And here we can see the recommended percentage of the top 10 bad actors is supposed to be on the order of 1 to 5%. So the example we saw, we were looking at 52%, which meant you've got work to do. The quantity of chattering and fleeting alarms, ideally it should be 0. And if you have some, you have plans to address or fix that. The number of stale alarms, ideally less than 5, again with plans to address whatever's causing them. So you can see that there's KPIs related to how to assess your nuisance alarm issues and how bad they are, and to help you drive them to acceptable performance. So now let's talk about human factors. The wild card in all this is the operator. And if we think about how an operator responds to an alarm, if we model that as talked about in the ISA and IEC standards, it really consists of 3 steps. First, the operator needs to detect that the alarm is there. So they have to become aware of the alarm. Then they need to diagnose what the problem is and figure out what has happened and what corrective action they should take. And then the last step is for them to actually take that corrective action in response to a deviation, hoping that that will correct the problem. Now, if we look at those 3 steps, we can see that nuisance alarms, or the presence of nuisance alarms, impact or have an impact in each and every one individually. Stale alarms or chattering alarms will affect or impact the ability for the operator to detect a new alarm. So as I mentioned earlier, if the alarm summary display is full of alarms, full of stale alarms, that will make it harder for the operator to detect, that first step in the process, to detect a new alarm. Similarly, the second step, diagnosis, if the operator is being inundated with nuisance alarms, they may develop a pattern of ignoring alarms, which is going to make it hard, as we talked about in the example of the sump pump overflow. They may not correctly diagnose what is going on if they are ignoring certain relevant data. But of course, they don't necessarily know in which scenarios it's okay to ignore the alarm or not ignore the alarm. And then when it comes to response, certainly if you've got nuisance alarms and they're impacting the detection and diagnosis, that may also impact the ability for the operator to respond correctly, because they may have an incorrect assessment of what the problem is. So they may either take no action or they may take the wrong action. Either of those is typically termed operator error. But what I want you to think about is operator error really a thing? Is it really a valid explanation of what has happened or what is going on? If there are nuisance alarms and it is impacting the ability of the operator to detect the alarm and then to diagnose it correctly, wouldn't it be reasonable to think that their response may be incorrect or impacted because of the first two steps? I would think it would be. And we're going to talk about whether operator error is really a significant phenomena here. Now, situation awareness and nuisance alarms impact situation awareness. What is situation awareness? It's really the goal for the environment that you want to have for the operator to be able to live up to what we talked about earlier, that knowledge worker, being able to take in external cues of what's happening, process data, HMI data, alarms, and understand what is happening, make sense of what's happening now, and project that out into the future so they know what they need to do to prevent situations from occurring. So nuisance alarms can have a significant impact on the ability of the operator to have that situation awareness, because they don't know of the external cues, which ones do they rely on, which ones are correct that they take action on, and which ones do they ignore. So you can imagine, if you're trying to understand what's happening, if you were a doctor and you're going to get incorrect temperature readings when you're taking the temperature of a patient, that's going to really make it hard for you to figure out what the problem is, because you don't know which of your external cues you can count on and which ones are not correct. So now let's look a little bit at signal detection theory and alarms and relate that to human behavior. So we see two Gaussian distributions there showing signal detection and noise. So for an operator to detect an alarm, that's the signal, that's the valid alarm case. The noise case is the false alarm or the nuisance alarm. Ideally, we want to have those peaks be as far apart as possible. That would make it easiest from a signal detection theory, easiest for the operator to be able to distinguish the alarm. Now, when we talk about noise in this context, we don't necessarily mean audio noise. We mean noise in the environment, so it could be visual. So for example, if red is the color that you use for alarms, but you are also using red for the status of your pumps or process piping, you have now created noise that will make it harder for the operator to detect that new alarm. Now, the fact that these plots overlap, you can see there's an area here where you have the possibility of both a false alarm and a true alarm, where it will be up to the operator to make a decision whether the alarm is a valid one or is a false alarm. So the further apart we can make those two peaks, the smaller that area is. But we have to realize that there's actually a trade-off between minimizing nuisance alarms and missing valid alarm conditions. Signal detection theory would say you can't really totally eliminate all nuisance alarms without the impact of possibly then missing some valid alarm conditions. So there is potentially somewhat of a trade-off, and that has to be factored into the definition and creation of alarms. Now, when we look at the area under the curves here, as we said, it's going to be up to the operator to decide in this gray zone where an alarm could be a false alarm, could be a nuisance alarm, or it could be a valid one. How do they set their criteria? How do they set their tolerance? And it could be different for every person. And in many cases, it's based on past history. So if you've an operator that has been operating the plant and it gets a lot of nuisance alarms, then that is going to be factored into their thinking and thought process and behavior process for when a new alarm comes in. They've been conditioned based on past history that you will have a lot of nuisance alarms. So taking that into account, how does that drive their behavior? Well, some human performance studies were done, and they showed that if you have a 25% false alarm rate, and a false alarm could be, the operator just doesn't need to respond. It's not really requiring their action. But if you have a 25% alarm rate, that is significant enough that the operator will stop relying on the alarm system for the detection of abnormal events. 25% is not that high. Other studies have shown that it really needs to be 5% or less to really have that integrity of the operator will rely on the alarm system and investigate every nuisance alarm as you would like them to, but to do that, your false alarm rate or your nuisance alarm rate needs to be pretty low, needs to be 5% or less. Another key piece of information that came out of those studies is that the operator's confidence in a particular alarm that occurs. So let's say you have a new alarm. What does the operator think of that? Do they think it's a valid alarm immediately, or do they think it's possibly a false alarm, or likely a false alarm or a nuisance alarm? Well, that is impacted by the number of other alarms that you have. So if you have a summary display that's got 15 or 20 stale alarms on it, and you get a new alarm, because of that other existing pattern, the operator is more likely to think that that new alarm is not a valid alarm because of the other scenarios that you have there, because of all the other false alarms that you have present. So that's important to know. Now, when it comes to ignoring nuisance alarms, that sounds like a bad thing. It sounds like poor behavior and something that could be the operator could be disciplined for example. You could say that every alarm that occurs, we expect and want the operator to respond. Well, actually, as you'll see, from a human factors point of view, ignoring false alarms or ignoring nuisance alarms is normal human behavior. And it's actually what you would expect and want, because the operator has essentially realized that that alarm does not require their attention. Now, it's not like the operator is sitting there with nothing to do. Their job is to optimize the process in the plant. So they have plenty of other things to do or to worry about. So the ability to ignore a nuisance alarm essentially allows them to focus on more important tasks, which is actually what you would want an operator to do. So the way that you correct or change the operator's behavior of ignoring alarms is not by disciplining them, it's by eliminating or mitigating the nuisance alarms. Now let's look at that impact on safety and operator reliability. Let's say that we've done a layer protection analysis and we have a safety alarm that we're counting on to provide some level of risk reduction. A risk reduction factor of 0.9, such as would be recommended by CCPS. That means that its probability of failure on demand is also 0.1, so 10% of the time. Well, let's look at a couple of what-if scenarios. What if that alarm that we're looking at for risk reduction is actually a nuisance alarm? how likely is it to be that the operator is going to respond correctly for that? That's the first scenario. How about the second scenario? What if the overall system has a lot of nuisance alarms, and this one good safety alarm is lost in the flood of other nuisance alarms? How likely do you think it is that the operator is going to respond correctly and appropriately? Probably not. So in reality, if you have nuisance alarms, whether it's for the particular safety alarm that you're looking at or the system overall, then chances are your probability of failure on demand is going to be much higher than 0.1. It would be more like 0.5, 0.9, or maybe 1, and you should not take credit for that alarm. So if nuisance alarms are a problem, you should really consider not taking credit for a risk reduction for those alarms. So now let's shift to how do we eliminate nuisance alarms. The ISA standards and the IEC standard define the definition of what an alarm is supposed to be. Our rationalization process, which we'll talk about shortly, is a way to make sure that every alarm that is configured matches this definition, meaning it's for the operator, indicates an abnormal condition, and requires a timely response. One of the other things that will factor into that is thinking about all the operator notifications, some which truly require the operator action and represent an abnormal condition. Those are true alarms. We want to differentiate these non-alarm notifications, though, because those might be what we are calling nuisance alarms. So we may have a situation where there is an abnormal event and we're telling the operator about it, but there's no corrective action required. Well, that's not really an alarm. We can call it an alert, as we see here. But the purpose of categorizing it is so that we can separate those notifications out of the summary displays for alarms. So now those are no longer nuisance alarms. They're still valid information. They're just not alarms, and we want to present them separately. But the main way to correct nuisance alarms from an alarm management point of view is to go through the alarm rationalization process, a series of steps, checking the alarm validity, assessing the consequence, cause, confirmation, corrective action, operator response time. Those are the first things that you look at. Those are the key ones to get rid of nuisance alarms. Then there are other steps in the rationalization process once you've determined that it's a valid alarm. And our SIL alarm tool will actually guide you through the rationalization process and help you make the appropriate decisions as to whether something is a nuisance alarm or not. But the way you start that is with some criteria, and you can determine this criteria or pull this criteria from the definition of an alarm. So for a given alarm, we would ask, does this alarm indicate a malfunction, deviation, or abnormal condition? Yes or no? If you can't answer yes to that question, then it likely should not be an alarm. Second, does it require a timely operator action to avoid defined consequences? Again, if you can't answer yes, it should not be an alarm. And there are other criteria as well. Is it unique? Is it the best indicator? So we can apply that criteria very quickly to assess whether it's a valid alarm and requires additional consideration, or whether it's not and it should be removed as an alarm and maybe recategorized as an alert or something else. So here's an example of applying that to our sump pump situation that we talked about. Same one from the video, same one from the incident. In this case, as required by the design, the sump pump will automatically turn on when the level reaches 85%, which is also the high alarm limit, and it will automatically turn off when the level reaches 10%, which is also the low alarm limit. So if we apply our alarm rationalization criteria to this, and we look at the high alarm, that was the one that was causing the nuisance alarm in this scenario as we looked at, we apply our criteria, and we ask first, does this alarm indicate an abnormal condition? The answer would be no, it doesn't. It's really indicating just that the level has gotten high enough that the pump needs to turn on, and that the pump is turning on. So it's really a notification of an event. Does it require a timely operator action? No, it doesn't, again. So there's nothing that the operator needs to do. That high alarm is really just indicating that the pump is turning on. So again, thinking back to the overflow scenario that we talked about, this is why the operator was ignoring that high alarm, because there was nothing for them to do, and it didn't indicate an abnormal situation. So it really should not have been an alarm at all. So now let's apply the next steps of the rationalization process, identifying what the cause of the alarm likely causes would be, identifying what the potential consequences would be, the direct consequence, what would happen if the operator didn't take their corrective action, not the consequence if all layers of protection failed. We also want to define the corrective action. These are actions that will essentially correct the situation. So just acknowledging the alarm or general troubleshooting probably do not count as corrective actions. We want to talk about what needs to be done to fix the situation. And a new one to consider is confirmation. How can the operator verify that the alarm is not false? More details on that shortly. But the idea would be is if we can't identify what the consequence is, or the only consequence is another alarm occurring, or there's no corrective action, then again, it likely should not be an alarm. Now, confirmation. This is not something that classically people identify or document during rationalization, but it's something to think about including going forward in your rationalization process. And why is that? It's because if the operators have developed a mentality of ignoring alarms because they're nuisance alarms, then by providing confirmation information, which is essentially the ability to cross-check, that allows the operator to determine for themselves whether it is a false alarm or a real alarm. So, for example, if you had a high pressure in a reactor and the operator wasn't sure whether that was a real alarm, thought it could be a nuisance, what could they do? Well, they could look for other pressure measurements. What if there are other sensors? Or they could look at the temperature to get a feel for whether that alarm is likely real. So very important to provide information to the operator to be able to confirm that the alarm is real. And that's really not just during the rationalization process. That should actually be thought about during the HMI design process as well. We want the visual displays to make it easy for the operator to quickly confirm that an alarm is real or not. And providing this confirmation is one of the keys to wean the operator off of the behavior of ignoring alarms. If you provide them auxiliary information so that they can decide themselves whether it's a false alarm or not, then you will increase the likelihood that they will respond to that alarm. During the rationalization process, we will capture all that information. If you're using our SIL alarm tool, we can extract that information and create alarm response procedures, which would show the operator then what points they could look at to confirm that the alarm is real. A good operator would likely know what process points are related. You know, no process variable changes unto itself without influencing other process variables in a connected process. So a good operator would likely know how they're interrelated, but documenting that information and making it available for the operator when that alarm occurs can be helpful as well, particularly for new operators. So one of the common questions then is to eliminate redundant alarms, a type of nuisance alarm. How do we determine when it's okay to have both a high and a high alarm for a single tag? And as we went through and analyzed what it takes to be an alarm, cause, consequence, corrective action, the criteria we can develop is that something about the two alarms needs to be different. So either the cause needs to be different, the consequence would need to be different, or the corrective action, the operator response in kind or degree. And what I mean there is if you look at this tank example where we're going to get a high level. If the operator's range of corrective actions relate to just the manual valve, then when the high level alarm first occurs, the operator response could be to reduce the flow in that manual valve. And then if the level continues to increase, causing the high level alarm to occur, then at that point they would stop the flow. So this would count as two different valid corrective actions because they are different in kind or degree. Now, one of the other causes of nuisance alarms is you're just not setting the alarm limit correctly. So if we look at the alarm set point, we are essentially trying to set it somewhere between your normal operating scenarios and the consequence that you are trying to prevent. So let's say we're looking at pressure, and the consequence is lifting of a relief valve. If we can define what that setting is, then we want to set the alarm limit somewhere in between the normal operating envelope and that PRV setting. If we know the process dynamics and rate of change, we can set that limit to make sure that the operator has sufficient time to respond. And again, when you look at it from this point of view, you can see that if that alarm limit is too close to your normal operating envelope, then you will get nuisance alarms just from normal fluctuations, where the abnormal situation is not that bad yet. But on the other hand, if you're too close to the consequence threshold, preventing nuisance alarms, your operator won't have sufficient time to respond to prevent the consequence. So it requires some thought to balance the need to prevent nuisance alarms versus making sure the operator has sufficient time to respond. So we need to set the alarm limit correctly. Now, we may find that the alarm limit actually needs to be different depending upon the state of the process. And this is a common cause of stale alarms. If we are running at different rates or during a startup or a shutdown phase, the alarm limit may need to be different. And one of the ways to eliminate stale alarms then is to define dynamic alarming, essentially the ability to have the alarm have a different limit depending upon the state of the process. The main way to eliminate nuisance alarms is by the application of alarm deadbands and on-off delays. So deadband, if we look at this figure here on the left, we see that we have a process variable that's increasing, going through its alarm point, but just based on the natural fluctuation of the process variable, we can see that it's going above and below that alarm limit. Every time it does that, it creates a new annunciation to the operator. So in this scenario on the left, we actually get 4 alarm events, chattering alarms. Alarm goes in and out, in and out, in and out. And that's just because it's a naturally fluctuating process variable. So the way to buffer that or smooth that out is by the application of an alarm deadband, which presents a range that the process variable needs to go through to clear before the alarm would essentially be eliminated from being shown to the operator. So this will actually reduce the number of times the alarm is enunciated, and that's essentially how we get rid of chattering alarms. There are recommended values defined in the ISA standard and MUA 191. Probably best to consider these as upper guidelines to apply based on understanding the process and looking and seeing which alarms that you're having problems with before applying them as a blanket default. So let's look at how deadband actually influences an alarm. So let's say we've got a pressure situation. We have a scenario where we have a pressure indicator that's scaled from 0 to 100 PSIG, and we have a high alarm set at 90. So the limit is 90, and we have a deadband at 2%. So as soon as the pressure goes above 90%, that's when the alarm is triggered. Any fluctuations between 88 and 90 do not cause the alarm to clear. The alarm will not clear until it drops all the way below 88. So that's the example of how to eliminate a chattering alarm. Now, if you set the deadband too wide or too big, and sometimes you can do that purposely or unknowingly or make a mistake, then you can end up with the scenario where the alarm occurs and it never clears because the process variable doesn't drop down low enough. There's one example of a customer I was working with where the operators knew that at some point when they looked at the alarm summary display, you had some stale alarms that it could look at and they could see, and they knew what the actual value was and they knew what the trip point was, or the alarm limit. And sometimes they knew when they got close but not completely cleared that the only way to clear that alarm was to temporarily go in and change the deadband to 0 so that the alarm would essentially be cleared, and then set it back to what it was supposed to be. So in this case, they were correcting stale alarms by momentarily changing the deadband to 0 and then changing it back to the initial value, probably because the deadband was set too big, too large. Alarm on and off delays are other ways to eliminate nuisance alarms. These delays essentially can be put in to control the annunciation or clearing of the alarm, forcing the alarm to be in a true condition or a false condition for a certain period of time before you make that change. So that's another way to eliminate chattering alarms, and it can be applied to both analog and digital alarms, not just digital. And actually there's language in the standards now that say every control system is supposed to provide deadband and on-off delay information or capabilities within the alarm system, because these are so important to be able to eliminate nuisance alarms. Now, when it comes to implementation, deadband is typically the most powerful, so that would be applied first. On delay would be applied next, and that can eliminate chattering and fleeting alarms. But you do have to be mindful of the fact that you are delaying the notification of the alarm to the operator. So if you were implementing something with a significant on delay of maybe 30 or 60 seconds, but the operator had less than 5 minutes to respond as part of your rationalization process, you determined that, then you're robbing the operator of a lot of potential response time. So that would not be a good design situation. Off delay is then the least powerful one to use, and that's what you would use after deadband and on delay. Now, there was a study done by ASM, or the Abnormal Situation Management Consortium, for some plants in the UK, and they found just by tweaking these parameters, on delays, off delays, and deadbands, that they could reduce the number of alarms that the operator saw by 45 to 90%. And if they're reducing alarm instances by that, chances are most of those alarms were nuisance alarms. Another way to eliminate redundant alarms is to think about scenarios where you have one alarm occurring and it causes another alarm because of the way the equipment interacts. Example would be a pump where we have a low discharge pressure alarm that will go off anytime the pump is stopped. So we could end up with that as a nuisance alarm. So instead of alarming off of just the pump's discharge pressure amount or its value, we would want to incorporate into the alarm processing the fact that the pump is running as well. So we kind of create a smart alarm that says pump level or pump pressure must be less than X and the pump must be running. And this is a way to eliminate that nuisance alarm and the redundant alarm of pump has failed and we have a low discharge pressure alarm, because we would know that those two would be related. So now, kind of summarizing or getting toward the close here, what are the benefits of doing rationalization? We said that was a key to eliminating nuisance alarms. So if you go through that rationalization process, that will help you, if you do it correctly, eliminate or minimize nuisance alarms. Now, we talked earlier about The wild card here is the human factors, the operator's response, the operator's behavior. Just eliminating the nuisance alarms in your system may not be enough by itself to change the operator's behavior. So how do we shift the operator's reliance on the alarm system? Well, they should be taking part in the rationalization process. And as they see that alarms, nuisance alarms or redundant alarms are being eliminated, they will hopefully realize that from now on, when an alarm occurs, they need to respond at that point in time, because they're not going to get a second, third, or fourth notification of that condition. So that will help change their thinking related to alarms in the system. So if they've gotten to a point where they are discrediting or not valuing the alarms from the system, then taking part in rationalization and realizing for themselves that those nuisance alarms are being eliminated, then that will factor into their behavior and changing their behavior of when they need to respond. And a very common comment coming out of rationalization from operators is that, hey, we're not going to be able to ignore alarms anymore. Every alarm that's left is actionable, so we're going to have to take action as soon as that alarm comes in. So rationalization then and operator involvement in that process is a key to changing the operator's behavior or mentality. Now, you may not be able to prevent all nuisance alarm scenarios, so another key tool is to allow or provide the ability for the operator to shelve the alarm. Now, this is a mechanism where the operator suppresses the alarm temporarily, so the alarm disappears, goes out of their view for a fixed period of time, and that it's different from disabling it, because if you disable an alarm, it's gone forever unless you re-enable it. If you shelve an alarm, the alarm is suppressed for a certain period of time, but it's not lost, it's on a different display, and then it will come back after that period of time is over. Now, shelving is actually a required functionality per the IEC and ISA standards because of its importance to be able to deal with nuisance alarms. So you can't prevent all nuisance alarms. So to help the operator deal with, for example, a chattering alarm, the best way is to provide them the ability to shelve that alarm or temporarily suppress it when they know that it is a nuisance alarm. And to make sure they're doing that under the right scenarios appropriately, you can have them document why they're doing it, and then you should also be reviewing the list of alarms that are suppressed or shelved to make sure it's being done for the right reason. And then that also is an indicator of alarms that need to be fixed. So now, in summary of what we've looked at, if you have nuisance alarms in your system, operators will ignore those alarms. This is normal human behavior, and it's to be expected. Now, to change this behavior requires a number of steps. First, you need to identify which alarms are the nuisance alarms so that you can get rid of them. So measuring the performance and identifying your problem alarms is a key first step. Then from a mediation point of view, you want to perform alarm rationalization. That'll weed out the alarms that don't belong, hopefully eliminate the nuisance alarms, and it allows you to identify the confirmation. Remember, this was, what do I look at to validate or confirm that this alarm is real? So it's information that the operator can use themselves to make the decision about responding to the alarm. So it's important to wean them off of the behavior of ignoring alarms. Second key step in mediation is application of deadbands and on-off delays. We also want to evaluate the alarm limit, make sure it's set correctly, and consider whether that limit needs to be different depending upon the state of the process. Dynamic alarming may be required to eliminate those types of nuisance alarms. And then just because you can't pre-engineer every situation, you should provide or look to provide alarm shelving capability for the operator so that when a nuisance alarm does occur, that they can take action to eliminate it from their field of view so it doesn't impact their ability to focus on the key tasks at hand. And last but not least, if you have nuisance alarm issues, and these could be nuisance alarm issues for a particular alarm that you're taking risk reduction for, or just the whole overall system, then you should really reconsider using alarms for risk reduction unless or until you eliminate those nuisance alarms and get to the performance metrics that we talked about earlier that were defined in the ISA standard. So on that note, we'll open it up to questions. Say thank you very much for attending. I would want to point you to our website where we have a bunch of other webinars from the past that are recorded that you can listen to on demand, including to some that go into more details about some of the topics that we talked about. For example, the Master the Basics of Alarm Management from February 2016 goes into even more detail of the setting of deadbands and on-off delays. So if that's something that you would want to learn more about, I'd encourage you to check out that webinar. And then if you have any questions, please feel free to shoot me an email with information or with any questions that you do have. So there was one question about how would one consider alarm deadband for a new project under construction, so for a greenfield. So what I would recommend is that you look at the recommended values or potential values defined in the ISA standard and MUA. Based on process variable type, there are some recommended deadbands to consider. Look to potentially apply those, or you can just set a standard 0.5% or 1% deadband across the board and then adjust later on based on operating performance. There's a couple of control systems that, for example, have a default deadband of 0.5% or 1%, and I think what you'll find is in most cases that's sufficient, and it's only in a small fraction of them do you need to make it any different from that. How do we manage the flooding of alarms during a plant startup or during an upset? That's a good topic. I think we'll address that in another webinar that we'll do in the future on advanced alarming and alarm flood suppression. Continuing to go through the questions here. And then there was a question about differentiating alarms for different phases of operation during startup or operation. So we talked about potentially changing the alarm limits during those times. It may be more appropriate to disable or suppress the alarm during different phases. So that's another dynamic alarming technique, or to change the priority. So that's a little bit more elaborate in terms of making sure that the alarm is only presented in the states that it's relevant with the appropriate alarm limit during that state. So and on that note, I think we will wrap it up, and I will say thank you very much for attending, and I hope you will check out more of our exida webinars, and we really appreciate you tuning in. Thank you, and hope to talk to you next time.